last speaker of the session to join me. In the meantime, so we will be discussing gender, discussing modernities, the many lives of the Spanish defense of women in Europe and America. There you go. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, hello. I want to discuss this afternoon the circulation of exactly the same essay that Susan has presented. This essay originally published in Spanish in 1726, entitled Defensa de las Mujeres. So I want to discuss, I won't be focusing on a particular translation, but we'll give a broader overview of its circulation around Europe and colonial Latin America in the 18th and early 19th century. I will briefly compare the existing translations and the context in which they appeared and were disseminated and commented, asking when, how, by whom, and for what readership the text was adapted, reviewed, reused, or contested. What did translators, printers, booksellers, readers, reviewers who adapted, marketed, and read this essay for almost a century after its original publication see in it? To answer this, we need to consider, as we have been doing this morning, translation as rewriting, appropriation and circulation in different cultural and often temporal contexts by different actors. A crucial insight of translation studies, intellectual and cultural history, and more recently also of gender history. Translations, and we've been discussing this at length, tell complex stories that are not about unilateral reception, but about different individuals and communities of knowledge, reframing and resignifying texts across languages, cultures, and times. We already know a bit about Feijóo, but I'll explain a little further for those who don't know this essay. That was part of a larger work by this Spanish enlightened writer and Benedictine monk. The wider work of which it made a part was the Teatro Crítico Universal de Errores Comunes, Critical Theatre of Common Errors, an immensely successful 9-volume collection of essays challenging all kinds of prejudice and superstition, aimed at a broad educated readership with a style combining erudition and humor. The Defense of Women, last and longest by far of the 16 essays in Volume 1, triggered a violent polemic in Spain's intellectual circles, one of the many that marked its author's controversial career. As a cleric, Feijóo did not question male political and domestic authority, which he stated was determined by providence. However, he rejected the idea of women's natural inferiority with arguments and examples aimed at lay and learned readers alike. In his view, both popular superstitions and academic scholarship, including the much revered Aristotelian and Galenic thesis, and the new ideas about the greater sensitivity of female nerve fibers, were wrong. Nothing but philosophical and scientific theories constructed ad hoc to justify social prejudices. Against these theories, he asserted women's capacity to rule, moral excellence, and intellectual equality, with both rational and empirical arguments on the sexless nature of the soul, and more traditional examples of learned women from all nations, that is, from all European nations. Feijóo's works were widely disseminated, especially, but not only, in the Hispanic world, as demonstrated by their numerous editions, their large print runs, and their presence in countless institutional and private libraries. The Defense of Women itself was published in other languages at least 11 times, either separately or as part of complete or abridged translations of the critical theatre, or, as we've seen, of journal sections. And it was widely reviewed and cited. The far-reaching and lasting impact of Feijóo's Defense of Women raises significant questions. It endorses a multi-centered understanding of Enlightenment discussions of gender, and makes us wonder how modernity was framed by the author and by his readers and critics in relation to Catholicism, again, something that we discussed before, and to national stereotypes. It also stimulates reflections about what we might call transtemporal translation, the process by which texts written long ago are redefined and turned into symbolic contemporaries. As we will see, this essay was translated, discussed, and used in different linguistic contexts in specific territories, in particular social and intellectual circles, aristocratic, literate, ecclesiastical, middle class, male, or mixed. The specific interests of all these local, national, and transnational communities shape variations of the broader debates on gender, on the social identity of letters, and on modern civilizations, among other topics, that were part of the European and American culture of the time. This essay resonated particularly in the French context, where defending female aptitude in the face of misogyny was a tradition rooted in aristocratic sociability. Mixed salon and male-only academies were communicating vessels linked by friendship and patronage and governed by a shared code of politesse and honnêteté, which ascribed to women an aesthetic, moral, and intellectual authority. As Anthony Leboeuf has shown, these male-female friendships and connections were part of the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, but were also a source of fear about the feminization of the male mind that haunted educated men of the period. The translation and discussion of the Defensa de las Mujeres in France brought to the surface the tensions experienced by its writers between salon, academy, and literary market, and more broadly, the anxieties generated by the culture of politesse and gallantry, extolled as the height of European civilization and proof of French cultural hegemony, but also denigrated as frivolous, feminized, and feminizing. The reception given to the first volume of the Théâtre Critique, translated by Nicolas Vaquet d'Armilly, is a case in point. Issued in installments in duodecimo format so that readers could create their own personalized collection, the translator adapted this particular essay to his audience by adding biographical details about learned French women. The journals that reviewed the Théâtre Critique in French, and also specifically the Défense des Femmes, sometimes praised the author as an impartial intellectual position, as a scholar, a cleric, and a Spaniard, at a triple remove from mundane culture. Others, on the contrary, praised his ability to charm the ladies. And here we have, I don't have the time to go through the quotations, but you can see them here. So this is struggling between Feijó as an impartial intellectual and Feijó as a cleric who knows how to charm the ladies in proper 18th century gallant style. Or others condescendingly admitted some merit in his essay, only to emphasize the temporal precedence, and that's very important, and superiority of French writers on this subject. In Britain, where Feijó was better known than any other contemporary Spanish writer, the defense of women also sparked particular interest at a time when, as Karen O'Brien wrote, quote, "The place of women in the moral, intellectual, and social life of the nation was discussed and debated as never before." In its Spanish original or in French translation, it gained early recognition in blue-stocking circles and other assemblies bringing together literary men and women, from Samuel Richardson to Elizabeth Carter, or Oliver Goldsmith, as we've seen here. Hester Chapone expressed her surprise that, quote, "Spaniards should think so favorably of women," echoing the cliches influenced by the Black legend that depicted Spanish women subject to despotic confinement and oppression. English versions followed. The first one, we've just heard about it in the 1760, 1761 in the Ladies' Magazine. An anonymous one in 1768, probably, dedicated to Mrs. C, a woman of the local gentry, with a 10-page tribute to contemporary British women of letters. A second, third one in 1778 by a retired Royal Army officer, reissued in 1780. Female writers and patrons such as Hester Chapone, Elizabeth Carter, and this anonymous Mrs. C seem to have seen in Feijó's essay an authoritative demonstration of women's intellectual capacities that correlated with their own aspirations, while male translators used it to ingratiate themselves with their female friends and patrons. Moreover, the fact that the author was foreign enabled translators, critics, and readers of both sexes to see themselves as part of a transnational literary community united by its devotion to rational thinking and rejection of vulgar prejudices. The critical review derided the essay and presented misogyny as typical of a country like Spain, overshadowed by the darkness of ignorance, and long ago overcome in Britain. However, at the end of the century, translations of Feijó's Defense of Women were still for sale in London bookshops, and it could also be borrowed from William Lane's circulating library by a middle-class and popular readership. A new translation, the last one in its time, was published in 1810-11 in the Ladies' Magazine, another Ladies' Magazine, a later one, this one. A miscellaneous periodicals with a large male and female readership that deployed textual and iconographic strategies to document the work of female intellectuals with a transnational vision that established symbolic genealogies between women of different countries, languages, and periods. In Italy, Feijó's works were widely read in Spanish and in 3 different translations of the Teatro Crítico, seemingly aimed at the small erudite or aristocratic readership. Okay, how do we know that? Because they were in quarto format, much bigger, much larger than the French ones, high in price and quality, translated by obscure translators, some of them clerics. The 3 versions appeared in prominent publishing centers that had special links with the Spanish monarchy: Naples, Genoa, and Rome, cities where women participated in aristocratic sociability and cultural life. I'm particularly interested in the Roman version of the essay issued during the pontificate of Benedict XIV, a learned pope who supported a number of female scholars, including Laura Bassi and Maria Gaetana Agnesi, as we know. And this version is particularly interesting because it's the one that is more clearly linked to the local networks connecting the nobility, Roman nobility, and intellectuals with the Curia. Its translator also contributed through the addition of a specific appendix on Italian women of letters. We see here the Alcune donne celebri che vivano, to the construction and international prestige of an Italian cultural space. In Portugal, Feijó's works enjoyed a wide circulation aided by the country's geographic, political, and linguistic proximity to Spain. A 2-volume Portuguese edition offered a substantially shortened and simplified version of the original Teatro Crítico to readers of modest means and culture, including a Defensa das Mulheres in summary, 2 pages instead of the much longer original. A more cultivated readership seems to have read it in the original, which had a lasting influence on debates about women's intellect and education up to the beginning of the 19th century. So in Portugal, we see 2 parallel circuits: the abridged edition for less educated and less affluent readers, and the original Spanish version that was read by more educated readers. In Spanish America, Feijó was the most appreciated peninsular writer, closely connected to local networks of ecclesiastic and civil power. Although his views on gender equality seem to not have appealed to a predominantly ecclesiastical intellectual elite attracted by other aspects of his thinking, they seem to have aroused the interest of a wider lay readership, the type of readership men and women who frequented mixed tertulias and read periodicals where the debate on gender in moral and social reform featured prominently, as we have seen in the paper by Maricel Narende. They were also recycled in fascinating ways by two Brazilian-born writers, both publishing in Portugal, because there were no printing presses in Brazil in the whole colonial period. Teresa Margarida da Silva, in her Aventuras de Diófanes, argues, like Feijóo, that souls are genderless from her own perspective as a cultivated, socially experienced woman. Feliciano Joaquim de Sousa, in his Discursos Político-Morais, quotes him to uphold the intellectual equality of, quote, all rational creatures, regardless of sex or status, but taking pride in his Creole heritage and in the merits of women of Spanish and Portuguese colonial America. These readings and reworkings point at the Creole Enlightenment, which was an original and critical response to, rather than a mere imitation of the Enlightenment in the metropolis and in Europe at large. In conclusion, the way Feijóo's defense of gender intellectual equality echoed around Europe and America speaks about this capacity to challenge new generations and means that the interest it continued to arouse in Spain during the 19th century cannot just be related to the cultural backwardness of the Iberian world. The uses to which this essay was put in other cultural, linguistic, and political contexts challenge the idea of a linear history of thinking on gender difference and confirms that gender models continue to be a subject of discussion both in scholarly circles and for the emerging public opinion. New thinking about the complementarity of the sexes did not completely displace the assertion of rational equality or the glossing of illustrious women of the past. Even if couched in outdated language, this essay by the early 19th century must still have seemed a useful antidote to the new medical and philosophical theories about women's greater nervous sensitivity and lesser intellectual aptitudes. At a time when middle-class respectability predicated on female domesticity was on the rise, Feijóo's combative and somewhat old-fashioned essay continued to be reinterpreted and rewritten in the light of the present. Thank you.